Psalm 68. We'll read the first 4 verses. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let them also that hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melteth the fire before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. But let the righteous be glad, let them rejoice before God. Yea, let them exceedingly rejoice. Sing unto God, sing praises to his name. Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name Jah, and rejoice before him. It appears that this psalm is connected with the coming of the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, which is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 6, where you see a celebration not only of the event, but also of the faithfulness of God, giving Israel victory over her enemies, making the event possible. In those words, the first 3 words, let God arise, David is expressing something extraordinary, something amazing, something that would be very attention-getting. He is expressing the desire of his heart. And that's our subject, a heart desire for a God manifestation. I preached this message at the conference in Flat Rock. The theme there was, let God arise. And 6 preachers, counting myself, took it in different directions. But this, again, is the message that I preached there. Felt led of the Lord to do it again. It's not our intention to view the psalm in its details, but we do need to notice some things in order to help us know David's spirit and to understand what he means when he says, let God arise. So by noticing some features of the psalm, we get a little better grasp of where David was when he wrote those words, that as far as the spirit is concerned, and the meaning. So let's look first of all at just the composition of the psalm. David begins, let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. He begins with something that was said earlier in Israel's history. And he obviously had been made aware of it by reading the Scriptures. Numbers 10:35, we hear Moses praying, rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered. Let them that hate thee flee before thee. So Moses is praying there, rise up, Lord. But we come to Psalm 68. David uses these words, but not as a prayer, but as an expression of a desire. Let God arise. That's more of a desire than a prayer. And it is a desire centered upon God. So you have let, and then God arise, and then after that, let God arise, we see in verses 1 and 2, 3 times the word let. Each time with regard to God's enemies, David's enemies. An enemy is that which stands in the way. So what we read in verses 1 and 2 would be the result of, let God arise. And then you come to verse 3. And there is again the word let 3 times. But this time, it is with regard to God's people. First, notice, but let the righteous be. So it has to do with being something. Being always should precede doing. Be glad. And then the result of that is they'll do something. Let them rejoice before God. Let them exceedingly rejoice. So it is a desire centered upon God that will result in victory over that which is in the way, and it will result in us becoming something in relation to God, and then doing something in relation to God. It is a desire proceeding from a heart for God. In those 3 words, let God arise, David is expressing that God is what he needs. And he is expressing that God is what he wants. But those 3 words, again, they also establish the subject of the psalm. The subject is established in those words. Our attention is drawn to the main character of the psalm. The main character is not the enemies. The main character is God. And throughout the psalm, we see Him. We see He is referred to as God in this psalm 31 times. God, all capital letters, Jehovah, 1 time in verse 20. He is referred to as Jah, short form of Jehovah, 1 time in verse 4. There is the word Lord 7 times. And the word Lord, all capital letters, Jehovah, 1 time, or 2 times, verse 16 and 18. That makes 42 references to God. In addition to this, there are the pronouns Him, 5 times, His, 9 times, He, 4 times, Thou, 10 times, Thy, 6 times, Thine, 2 times, and Thee, 1 time. All total, with the names of God, that's 79 references to God. He's the focus. He is the focus of the psalm. This is seen in the arrangement of the psalm. The entire flow of the psalm is moving in the direction of God. Everything in the psalm is moving in the direction of God. In verse 4, there is an exhortation to do something unto God. We are to sing unto God. We are to sing praises to His name. We are to extol or glorify Him that rides upon the heavens by His name Jah, and rejoice before Him. It is an exhortation to celebrate the greatness of God. That's where the focus of the psalmist is. This is followed by verses 5 and 6, where you have a declaration concerning God, concerning His mercy, His grace, His love, His care, His miraculous transforming power in the lives of His people. And then you come to verse 7, and you read, O God, when Thou. Now he's talking to God. Because of the change in pronoun, the change of person, he is now talking to God. So there's a transition that takes place. at verse 7. And he continues to do so through verse 10. And talking to God, you will notice that what he's doing is he is recalling God's miraculous and powerful appearances to the Israelites, first of all, in the wilderness. And then David went on in verses 11-13 to reference certain periods in the history of Israel when God showed up in a mighty way for His people, miraculously providing their needs and overcoming that which stood in the way. And then in verses 15 through 18, God is in Zion, and He's there as conqueror for His people. All of this goes back to the original desire. Let God arise. And then in verses 19 through 24, there is again a celebration of the greatness of God. And then in verses 24 through 35, there is a processional of praise. The entire content of the psalm has its basis in and goes back to, let God arise. Everything is flowing from a heart for God. The psalm is a fervent longing for God. It is what we read in Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2. As the heart panteth after the water brook, so panteth my soul after Thee. My soul thirsteth for God. It is Psalm 40 or Psalm 63 and verse 1. My soul thirsteth for Thee. It is Psalm 143 verse 6. I stretch forth my hands unto Thee. My soul thirsteth for Thee. All those psalms are the words of an individual who is desperate for God. And when you come to Psalm 68, let God arise, it is one who is desperate for God. How desperate are we for God? How much do we want God in our lives? Let God arise. It is the expression of one who is in awe of who God is. We know that because we see the words, O God, O God. Verse 7, verse 9, verse 10, verse 24, verse 28, verse 35. O God. It expresses great emotion. It speaks of an awe of His person. Let God arise. So what does that mean? What does David mean when he says that? What is it that David is desiring? Let God arise. Throughout the psalm, David, by way of implication and also by direct mention, speaks of the presence of God. In verse 1, you read the words, before Him. In verse 2, you have the very words, the presence of God. In verse 3, you again see before God. Verse 4, before Him. In verse 7, thou wentest before Thy people. And in verse 8, twice, you read the presence of God. So in view of all of that, we read verse 1, let God arise. It has reference to a manifestation of the glorious presence of Almighty God. God showing Himself, showing who He is on behalf of His people. It is the desire for a bursting forth, for God to just burst forth on the scene, an outpouring of God. Let God arise. It is the desire for God to demonstrate His supremacy, to demonstrate His preeminence. All the foolishness that's going on all around us, all the insanity that is going on all around us, it'll be fixed in an instant if God were to burst forth and demonstrate His supremacy and His preeminence. So that ought to be our desire. Let God arise in an all-displaying display of God in such a way that it permeates and penetrates everything. It's like when He filled the tabernacle, when He filled the temple, in a way that is seen. Let God so arise that we see Him, that we feel Him, and that we experience Him. Let God arise. It is what David expressed in Psalm 63:2, to see Thy power and Thy glory. For God to burst forth, where we see, feel, and experience His power and His glory. It is God intervening. It is God disrupting our lives by showing us Himself. It is His transforming presence. Notice in verse 8, he's talking about one of these instances. He's talking about Mount Sinai. The earth shook. The heavens also dropped at the presence of God. Even Sinai itself was moved at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Moses declared, Exodus 19 verse 18, the whole mount quaked greatly. So what David is speaking of is a shaking and moving presence of God. Let God arise in such a way that it shakes and moves God's people. A shaking and moving presence. This is the fervent passion and longing of His heart, is that there be a clear manifestation, a clear presentation of God. For God to make Himself known in a way that changes lives. Do we want that? Do we have that desire for a person-changing, life-changing appearance of God? Most, if they're honest, no, I'm fine the way I am. But you're not. None of us are. It is God, a life-changing manifestation of God that has very definite and immediate and lasting impact upon the heart and upon the mind and upon the spirit. and upon every aspect of our life. Let God arise. This is the consuming desire of David's heart at this time, for a conquering manifestation of God over all that stands in the way, over everything that stands in the way of us and God. It is Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah saw God sitting on His throne. He saw Him lifted up and exalted above all others, above all else, as the sovereign, almighty power with absolute holiness. And as those seraphims sang, "Holy, holy, holy," the doorpost of the temple moved and were shook. But more important than that, Isaiah was shook. And Isaiah was moved. That's what we need. We need to see and feel and experience God in that way, where we're moved, where we're changed. It is God revealing Himself as God, causing us to have absolute confidence, being absolutely persuaded and convicted that He is God. And almost all of God's people that we know will say, I have that conviction that He is God. Then it's about time some started living it. You know it up here, but how often do we live? He is God. He is God. So let's make some application. First of all, that we would join the desire of our text. Let God arise. Let God arise. We need to make an honest, in-depth, personal examination. Do we have this fervent, passionate yearning and aspiration of heart? Do we long for more of God in our life? If that's our desire, it turns also into our prayer. Rise, Lord. So do we long for more of God in our life? Do we long for this manifestation of God? It is God revealing Himself in such a way that every fiber of my being is in awe of Him. It is God so revealing Himself that we truly recognize, acknowledge, and practice that God has all rights and all claims upon my life. Let God arise, so plainly revealing Himself that all we can do is want Him to have all. And we are willing to give it all up and let go of our importance, of our self-reliance, all of our plans, and all of our ways. Lord, You take it all. Oh, that God would show up in such a way that we would all fall to our knees and realize that He has absolute claim upon our lives. So showing forth Himself that we realize He is above all. He is over all. He is beyond all. And He is worthy of all. He is worthy of all. And that this would become a driving force in our lives. So manifest Himself that we would be thoroughly convinced that we cannot love Him enough and we cannot do enough in His service. That He would so manifest Himself that we would see that my life is sacred unto God. Our lives are sacred unto God. Bringing us to the point where we say, I'm not holding anything back. I'm not keeping anything to myself. I'm not concerned about what I can spend on me. I'm not worried about my personal entrance. I just surrender it all to God without any doubt, without any apprehension, without any hesitation. I give it all to God. All for God to manifest Himself. Where that is our reaction. And we realize it's all about Him and it's all for Him. Let God arise. That He would so manifest Himself that He becomes our consuming desire. He's all we want. He's our aspiration. He's our excitement. He's our conviction. It is God manifesting Himself that our lives move in the direction of Him and our hearts are filled with Him. He becomes the reason for everything we do. He becomes the purpose. He becomes the basis. He becomes the interest of our lives. The center. The priority. And by priority we mean He's first. He's never next. He's the priority. He's the passion. He's the aim. He's the dominating, controlling factor of our lives. Let God arise, causing every aspect of our lives to be lived with regard to Him and in respect of Him and in behalf of the Lord. It is being absorbed with God. Let God arise, showing forth Himself in such a way that we fully realize that He is our calling in life. He is our calling, causing us to loosen our grip on the things of the world and being more linked and weaved to Him. And not being so busy and so caught up and so distracted and entangled with the affairs of life and mesmerized by the things of the world that we're blind and deaf to God. But that God would so manifest Himself that He becomes everything in our lives. In this day when the lives of so many of God's people are defined by the philosophies and the reasonings and the manners and the fashions and the entertainment and the pursuits of what is an Antichrist world, all for a God manifestation that would shake and that would move God's people and all that stands in the way between us and God. It is God. It's a God inner working. It's a God stirring. It's a God inner disturbance that compels us to just go all the way with Him and to live life with Him and for Him. In this day when so many of God's people are accustomed, it becomes a way of life, accustomed to quenching the Spirit of God. We do it all the time. And when the ability to worship is gone, oh, how we need a stirring. Oh, how we need a provoking, an energizing, an overpowering of God that will cause an inner disturbance a movement. Moving us from mere formality and mechanical religion. Moving us from mere appearance. Moving us from the superficial. Moving us from religious platitudes and mere religion itself. A movement from the indifferent, the lackadaisical, the flippant, the carefree attitude toward God and the matters of God. Moving us from spiritual mediocrity and hypocrisy. Moving us from weary, exhausted, lethargic spiritual lives concerning the things of God. That we would be moved to an appetite, to an excitement, and a passion, and a zeal for God. A stirring, a shaking, a moving manifestation that will move individuals from a form of godliness to the power thereof. That's what we need. Let God arise. A stirring manifestation of God that will change the attitudes of God's people toward this book, toward God's house, toward God's day, toward God's people, toward God's man, toward God's message. A movement of God that will awaken God's people from the spiritual comas that they've slipped into and don't even know it. A movement that will cause a rekindling of first love, causing us to draw closer and closer to the Lord. Let God arise in such a manifest way that there's a shaking loose from self-centeredness, self-indulgence, self-assurance, self-will, self-seeking, self-agendas, self-righteousness, to a life of self-denial, and He just saturates our interests, our ways, our feelings, our viewpoints, our pursuits, our choices, our plans, our homes, and our worship. Let God arise. That all who have irreverence in their hearts toward God, their hearts are made to tremble. For God to arise in such a way that hearts that are cold and callous and apathetic are made tender. And hearts that are so crowded and so packed full and so distracted and pulled with the affairs of life are changed into hearts that are focused upon God. And hearts that are proud are humbled before God. And hearts that are oblivious and unthankful are made aware of God and thankful. And hearts that are troubled would be immediately filled with peace and assurance. And hearts that are joyless would be changed into a heart filled with a song. For God to arise in a manifest way, that there's a shaking loose from unbelief and a movement toward faith. A shaking loose from worry to a movement of full assurance. A shaking loose from frustration and a movement toward peace and contentment. A shaking loose from discouragement to a movement to joy. A shaking loose from doubt. If God were to so manifest Himself, and He has throughout history, that all doubt is gone. And there's conviction. A shaking loose from the opinions of man to a movement to thus saith the Lord. Oh, for a God manifestation in such a powerful way that God's people would be delivered, released, set free, renewed, and restored. And all those who are stuck in their thoughts and in their ways, that God would so manifest Himself that you're shook loose from your thoughts and from your ways. And those who are stuck in bitterness and anger and envy and on and on, a setting free from all of those things. A setting free from spiritually unfulfilling and empty lives. Lives of wandering in endless circles. Restless, unsettled, joyless, spiritually numb. Oh, that God would manifest Himself in such a way that those who are spiritually numb would be filled with feeling. Those who are spiritually exasperated would have a renewal of strength. Oh, for God to arise in such a way that we just hear all the chains breaking. And God's people being what they ought to be. I've got news for you. That'll fix a lot of problems. Even outside of this building. That'll fix problems in society if God's people would just get right. Again, 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, God knows everything that's going on. He knows all the perversion. But He says, if my people would. We've got to look at ourselves. Oh, that God would so arise that He would be the purpose of our lives. That our lives would be moved and shaped by Him. And as we've said many times, that God would so arise that when the service ends, it doesn't end. That's when you know there's been a God manifestation. Let me tell you something. If the service ends when it ends, nothing happened. Nothing really happened with us individually. Oh, for a God manifestation. That our lives would be moved and shaped by Him. That we would go from here trusting Him. If God were to so manifest Himself, you wouldn't walk out those doors not trusting Him, not serving Him, not submitting to Him, not obeying Him, not wholeheartedly thanking and praising Him. God would so arise that we would live spiritually abundant and flourishing lives. ascending and gaining in spiritual altitude day by day, living spiritually thriving lives with cups overflowing. That's what we need. Let God arise. But that's not the issue. The issue is not that's what we need. It is what we need. But the issue is, do we want it? That's really the issue. Do we have that desire? Let God arise. Where it disrupts everything that needs disrupting. For some, that would mean their whole lives are turned upside down. Everything that's in the way be moved. Let God arise. That needs to be our desire. Brother Ben, if you come, lead us